June 4, 1943. Railroad Street, Mexia, Texas, una fizia vera. Burkhart's hand shook a little as he wrote in his secret diary, words that could have landed him in solitary if his own officers ever found them. "The Americans must be lying to us," he scribbled. "How can any nation have this much while fighting on two fronts?" Looking out that train window, he'd just seen something that totally contradicted 3 years of what the Nazis had been telling them. Lights, electric lights everywhere. Every farmhouse, every street corner, every shop window lit up like it was nothing. Just an endless sea of lights spreading across the Texas plains at 10 p.m. Back home in Germany, they'd had blackout rules since 1940. Everything had been dark for years. And even before the war, barely 20% of German farms had electricity. But here, in this America that Nazi propaganda kept calling weak and collapsing, electricity flowed like it was water. The arrival. 1,850 veterans of Rommel's Afrika Korps climbed down from their train. And what a train it was. Not cattle cars or freight wagons like they expected, but actual passenger coaches, Pullman cars with cushioned seats, dining service, and sleeping berths. The whole town of Mexia had come out to see them arrive. Nobody knew it then, but this moment was about to trigger something huge. The most profound psychological shift in modern prisoner of war history. These men's entire worldview was about to be demolished, not by propaganda or lectures, but just by seeing American industrial power with their own eyes. The real story of Allied victory wasn't being written in battle plans. It was being written in production numbers that would completely shatter everything these soldiers thought they knew about their enemy, their homeland, and everything they'd been fighting for. The collapse begins. It all started on May 13, 1943, in Tunisia. General Jürgen von Arnim, who'd replaced Rommel, surrendered along with somewhere between 250,000 and 275,000 German and Italian soldiers. The exact number is fuzzy because scattered units kept surrendering over several days. These were the Wehrmacht's best desert fighters, guys who'd pushed the British all the way back to Egypt, men who'd earned respect even from Montgomery himself. And now, prisoners. Among them was Hetman Friedrich Radke, holder of the Iron Cross First Class, veteran of the France campaign, wounded twice in North Africa. His diary, found decades later in the National Archives, would give historians the most detailed look at how American captivity messed with German soldiers' heads. The journey from defeat to discovery. The transformation began in the port of Oran, Algeria. While Radke and 30,000 other POWs waited in temporary camps for transport ships, American efficiency was already starting to crack their assumptions. The US Army processed thousands of prisoners every single day with an organizational precision that beat anything the Wehrmacht had ever pulled off, even at their peak. Identity cards, photographed and filed, medical exams, done, shots administered, Geneva Convention rights, explained in perfect German by American officers who'd been specially trained exactly this. But the first real shock, the food. Oberreiter Hans Müller, captured with the 21st Panzer Division, wrote to his mother 8 months later, "In the cage at Oran, while we waited for ships, the Americans fed us better than we'd eaten in 6 months of desert fighting. White bread, real coffee, eat meat twice a day. We thought it was propaganda, that they were trying to impress us. We didn't realize this was just their standard military ration." The Liberty ships. The ships that would carry them across the Atlantic were themselves monuments to American industrial capacity. The SS Robert E. Peary had been built in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes at Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California. If the Germans had known that, they would have thought it was impossible propaganda. These vessels were being produced at a rate of 3 petha a day at the Ether K production. They'd been delivering supplies to Europe, and rather than sail back empty, they carried human cargo, up to 30,000 POWs per month, by summer 1943. The Atlantic Crossing. July 1943. The 2-week Atlantic crossing provided the second phase of psychological demolition. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann of the 90th Light Division kept detailed notes that survived in letters to his familiare Eli after he got home. The ship's crew, he noted, threw away more food waste each day than his entire company had received in weekly rations during their final months in Africa. The American sailors threw away half-eaten steaks, whole loaves of bread, gallons of milk that had sat too long, Zimmerman wrote. They did this openly, without thought, not to the chaos, but because to them this waste meant nothing. Their supply was limitless. The ships themselves became floating classrooms in American power. The POWs discovered their vessel was one of 2,710 Liberty ships being built during the war. Each one needed 250,000 parts assembled from components made in 32 states. The engines were built in 3 separate factories, each one churning out 900 horsepower cylinders that were then put together in ports that barely existed 2 years earlier. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Stobern, whose aristocratic Prussian family had served in every German war since Frederick the Great, would later write in his memoirs, "As our ship got close to the American coast, I watched the radar antenna rotating above the bridge. This technology, which we thought only we and maybe the British had in limited amounts, was standard equipment on a cargo ship. That's when I first suspected Germany had already lost the war." August 2, 1943. Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. The first sight of America destroyed what was left of Nazi propaganda about American weakness. The Norfolk base sprawled across 4,300 acres. Its docks stretched for miles, cranes loading and unloading dozens of ships at once. In a single day, this one port moved more tonnage than all of Hamburg managed in a week. Gefreiter Johann Weber, a factory worker from the Ruhr before he was drafted, co-unted 47 cargo ships in various stages of loading or unloading. Each crane, he noted in his secret diary, lifted loads that would have required a dozen men and horses back home. They moved with electric power, smoothly, continuously, without the coal smoke that chokes our industrial cities. The prisoners were formed into columns to march to the waiting trains. Along the way, they passed parking lots filled with civilian cars, hundreds of them belonging to dock workers. In Germany, owning a car was a privilege of the wealthy and party elite. The Volkswagen that had been promised to the German people since 1934. Still just propaganda, fewer than 1,000 had ever been delivered to civilians. Here, ordinary workers drove to their jobs in their own cars. The trains. But nothing prepared them for the trains themselves. Not boxcars, not the 40 and 8 inches wagons, 40 men or 8 horses, that had carried German troops across Europe, but full passenger coaches, Pullman cars with padded seats that converted to sleeping berths, dining cars with white tablecloths and real silverware, observation cars with panoramic windows. "We boarded like tourists, not prisoners," Headman Radka wrote. The American guard seemed almost embarrassed by the comfort. One sergeant apologized that the air conditioning wasn't working properly in our car. Air conditioning. In August. We'd thought such luxury existed only on Hitler's personal train. The 3-day journey. The 3-day train ride from Norfolk to the camps in Texas and Oklahoma would prove more destructive to Nazi ideology than any military defeat. As the trains rolled through Virginia, the prisoners pressed their faces against the windows, watching an America that supposedly couldn't exist according to everything they'd been told. Every small town blazed with light. Martinsville, Danville, Greensboro, towns that back in Germany would have been lucky to have a single electric street lamp, had lit-up shop windows, electric signs, houses with lights on in multiple rooms. They passed factories running night shifts, windows glowing, parking lots full even at midnight. Obergreiter Müller, whose father was a Nazi Party bloc leader in Hamburg, wrote in a letter discovered in 1987, "We passed through dozens of cities that first night. Everyone had more electricity than all of Hamburg. The guards told us this was normal, that every American town had had electricity since the 1920s. I called him a liar. He just shrugged and said we'd see." Witnessing American industry. In Roanoke, Virginia, the train stopped for water and coal. The prisoners watched as American railway workers did in 30 minutes what would have taken 2 hours back home. Automated coal loaders, electric water pumps, mechanized lubrication systems. Every part of the operation showed technological superiority. Even more disturbing was the casual wealth of the workers themselves. They wore their boots. Tan a hat would have cost a German laborer 2 months' wages. They drank Coca-Cola from glass bottles and tossed the empties away without a second thought. They smoked cigarettes continuously, stubbing them out half-finished. Feldwebel Heinrich Müller, an electrical engineer from Siemens before the war, calculated that the single railway yard they knocked electricity in 1 hour than his entire district in Berlin used in a day. The waste was magnificent, he wrote. They left lights burning in empty buildings. Electric fans ran in vacant rooms. It was the carelessness of infinite resources. Into the heartland. As the trains crossed into Tennessee and Kentucky, the prisoners saw American industrial power on full display. Through the windows, they watched endless factories, each one bigger than anything most had seen in Germany. The Alcoa aluminum plant in Tennessee stretched for 3 miles along the river. Its electric furnaces consumed 175,000 kilowatts of power, more than the entire city of Munich. Near Louisville, the trains slowed past the Rubbertown complex, where synthetic rubber plants had sprung from empty fields in just 18 months. 4 massive facilities, each employing thousands, produce 800,000 tons of synthetic rubber annually. Germany, despite inventing the process, had never managed more than 120,000 tons in its best year. Oberleutnant Erich Hoffmann, a chemist from IG Farben, understood right away. In a post-war interview, he recalled, "I knew those plants. I could see the distillation columns, the catalytic crackers. Each facility was more advanced than anything we'd built, and there were 4 of them in just this one spot. They told us there were dozens more across the country." Willow Run. The trains passed Ford's Willow Run plant outside Detroit, visible for miles. This single factory, built in just 9 months, produced a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. At peak production, 42,000 workers assembled bombers from 1,550,000 parts, made by 1,500 subcontractors. The plant covered 2.5 million square feet and used more electricity than the entire German city of Cologne. Hauptmann Wehrle, a Luftwaffe pilot shot down over Tunisia, pressed his face against the window as they passed. He counted 17 B-24s in various stages of completion, visible from the train. We'd been told American planes were inferior, hastily built, would fall apart in combat. But I could see the precision of the assembly lines, the quality of construction. These weren't inferior aircraft. They were just built faster than we could have imagined possible. The Mississippi and beyond. The deeper into America they went, the more complete became the destruction of Nazi mythology. In St. Louis, they crossed the Mississippi River on the Eads Bridge. Below them, barges carried more grain than Germany's entire 1942 harvest. The prisoners could see grain elevators stretching along both banks, each one holding enough wheat to feed a German city for months. Unteroffizier Karl Schmidt, a farmer's son from Bavaria, wrote in his diary, "The Americans transport food the way we transport ammunition, in endless quantities without worrying about loss. I watched them load a single barge with enough wheat to feed my entire village for 5 years. The crane operator was eating a sandwich with more meat than our weekly ration." Kansas City stockyards. In Kansas City, the train stopped at massive stockyards where tens of thousands of cattle waited for slaughter. The smell of meatpacking plants filled the air for miles. German POWs who'd survived on 200 grams of meat per week in Africa, when they were lucky, watched American workers eating beef sandwiches during lunch break. "They ate meat like we ate bread," wrote Gefreiter Paul Fischer. "No, that's wrong. They ate meat like we wished we could eat bread. The guard bought us hamburgers from a stand near the station, meat, cheese, and vegetables on white bread for 15 cents. He bought 20 of them without thinking and paid with a single dollar bill. This wasn't special. This was their normal food." Camp Hearn, Texas. The camps themselves provided the next level of cognitive shock. Camp Hearn, Texas, built in just 4 months, housed between 3,000 and 4,800 prisoners in conditions that beat what most had known as civilians. Wooden barracks with electric lights, flush toilets, hot showers, steam heat. Each building was built with more lumber than entire German villages had. The camp hospital amazed the medical people among the prisoners. Oberst Dr. Friedrich Bauer, chief surgeon of the 164th Light Division, found himself in a facility better equipped than most German civilian hospitals. X-ray machines, surgical equipment, pharmaceutical supplies that hadn't been available in Germany since 1941. All standard provisions for enemy prisoners. They had penicillin, Dr. Bauer later testified. This miracle drug we'd only heard rumors about. They used it freely, even on prisoners with minor infections. German soldiers were dying for lack of basic sulfur drugs, and the Americans were giving us their most advanced medicine without hesitation. The camp kitchen. The camp kitchen became another classroom in American prosperity. Prisoners assigned to cooking discovered walk-in refrigerators, electric mixers, automated dishwashers, and gas ranges that could prepare meals for 5,000 men. The daily ration included fresh milk, eggs, meat, vegetables, and white bread, quantities German civilians hadn't seen since 1939. Feldwebel Otto Krebs, a former hotel chef from Munich, wrote, "Today we threw away more food than my family has seen in 3 years. Not spoiled food, just excess. American regulations require preparing 10% more than needed to ensure every prisoner gets full rations. The surplus gets discarded. I wept as I threw perfectly good bread into the garbage." Working in America, September 1943. By September 1943, labor shortages in American agriculture led to the employment of POWs in fields and factories across the country. This decision, driven by necessity, would prove more destructive to Nazi ideology than any propaganda program could have been. Groups of prisoners were trucked daily to work sites, traveling through the American heartland without blindfolds or restricted routes. They saw everything: the endless fields of corn and wheat. The factories run 3 shifts. The shops are full of goods. The parking lots are full of cars. The houses with refrigerators and radios. At a cotton gin outside Houston, Unteroffizier Herbert Lang watched a single machine process more cotton in an hour than his entire village could have handled in a month, using traditional methods. The gin was powered by electricity from the Colorado River Authority, part of a rural electrification program that had brought power to 90% of Texas farms by 1943. The farmer who owned the gin was nobody special, Lang recorded. Not aristocracy, not a party member, just a farmer. Yet he had electricity, running water, a truck, a car, and a tractor. His workers, including the Negroes, ate lunch from boxes containing more food than German workers received in a week. And this was normal. Every farm we passed was the same. Nebraska farms. In Nebraska, prisoners worked in sugar beet fields, seeing agricultural mechanization that defied understanding. A single combine harvester, they learned, could do the work of 100 men. The fields stretched to the horizon, each one bigger than entire German counties. The farmers talked casually about yields that would have been fantasy back home. 60 bushels of wheat per acre, compared to Germany's 30 on the best land. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann, working on a farm outside Scotts Bluff, wrote, "The farmer's son, a boy of 16, drove a tractor worth more than everything my father earned in his lifetime. When I mentioned this, the boy laughed and said it wasn't even a particularly good tractor. His father was waiting for a new model from John Deere that would be even better." Factory work. The most devastating revelations came to prisoners who worked near or in American factories. While Geneva Convention rules prohibited direct war production work, POWs could work in industries that freed American workers for military production. This technicality let thousands of German prisoners witness American industrial capacity firsthand. At a Campbell soup factory in New Jersey, prisoners watched production lines that processed more tomatoes in a day than most German factories handled in a month. The facility operated with a skeleton crew of women and elderly men. Most young workers were in the military, yet production exceeded peacetime levels. Stabsfeldwebel Ernst Wagner, who'd worked in a German food processing plant before the war, documented the experience. Everything was automated: electric conveyor belts, automatic filling machines, steam cookers that processed hundreds of cans at once. One elderly woman monitored controls that managed what would have needed 50 workers in Germany. She did this while listening to the radio and drinking coffee. Detroit's River Rouge. Near Detroit, prisoners unloading coal at a power plant glimpsed the automotive industry's conversion to war production. The River Rouge complex, visible across the water, employed 100,000 workers producing jeeps, aircraft engines, and tanks. The plant consumed 1.5 million kilowatts of electricity daily, more than all of Hamburg. "We could see the parking lots," wrote Obergreiter Franz Kellner. "Thousands of cars belonging to workers. In Germany, even our officers rarely owned cars. Here, factory workers drove to work. The guard told us many workers owned 2 cars, one for work, one for family use. We thought he was mocking us." The psychological shift. Winter, 1943. By winter 1943, the cumulative impact of these observations was producing what American intelligence officers called ideological collapse syndrome among the prisoners. The Special Projects Division, the secret re-education program run by the Provost Marshal General's office, documented increasing numbers of prisoners requesting access to American newspapers, books, and educational materials. Major Paul Newland, a member of the monitoring team, reported in December 1943, "The prisoners no longer argue when shown production statistics. They've seen too much. The most fanatical Nazis have gone quiet. They still maintain loyalty to Germany, but no longer speak of victory. Many openly question what they were told about America." Camp newspapers. The camp newspapers produced by prisoners themselves started reflecting this transformation. Der Ruf, the Call, published at Fort Kearny, Rhode Island, gradually shifted from defiant nationalism to discussions of democracy, economic systems, and post-war reconstruction. The editors, carefully selected anti-Nazi prisoners, found their audience increasingly receptive. Lieutenant Hermann Gotz, captured with the 10th Panzer Division, wrote in a letter that passed American censors, "We were told America was a mongrel nation, weak, divided, controlled by Jews, incapable of military prowess. Every day I'm here, I see the opposite. This is the most organized, unified, and powerful nation on earth. We were told fairy tales by criminals." The Italian question. The most devastating blow to Nazi ideology came from an unexpected source: the treatment of Italian prisoners after Italy's surrender in September 1943. Italian POWs who agreed to cooperate were formed into Italian service units, given better quarters, increased pay, and more freedom. German prisoners watched their former allies working alongside Americans, eating in American restaurants, and some even dating American women. Hauptmann Friedrich Schultz wrote, "The Italians betrayed us, yet they're treated better than we treated them as allies. They work freely, earn money, and send packages home. The Americans show them no hatred. This democracy we were taught to despise appears more honorable than our own system." Christmas 1943. Christmas 1943 provided the most profound psychological impact. American organizations, churches, and civic groups sent 500,000 Christmas packages to German POWs, enemies who'd been trying to kill American soldiers just months earlier. Each package contained cigarettes, candy, toiletries, and games. Local communities invited prisoners to Christmas dinners, though regulations prevented most from accepting. At Camp Hearn, Texas, the local Methodist church choir performed Christmas carols in German for the prisoners. Women from Hearn sent in homemade cookies and cakes. Boy Scouts delivered handmade Christmas cards. This kindness toward enemies shattered the final remnants of Nazi racial theory. Oberleutnant Walter Müller, whose brother had died in the bombing of Hamburg, wrote, "They know we're their enemies. Many have sons and husbands fighting against our armies, yet they show us Christian charity. Not propaganda, but genuine kindness. What kind of people treat enemies this way? Only those certain of victory and secure in their power. The Christmas feast. The Christmas feast itself defied comprehension. Turkey, ham, mashed potatoes, gravy, vegetables, pies, ice cream, quantities of food Germany hadn't seen since before World War I. The prisoners ate until they were sick, unable to process such resources being spent on enemies. "We ate like kings," wrote Feldwebel Hans Bauer. "Better than German generals eat. Better than party leaders." And this wasn't special. The guards told us this was a normal American Christmas dinner, that every American family was eating the same meal. If they can feed prisoners this way, what must their own soldiers eat? Education programs. Early 1944. By early 1944, over 40,000 German prisoners were enrolled in educational programs. They studied English, American history, mathematics, and sciences. The University of Chicago provided correspondence courses. Stanford University sent professors to lecture on democracy and economics. The thirst for knowledge was incredible. Prisoners who'd been told Americans were barbarous, cultureless people discovered libraries with millions of books, universities that welcomed all social classes, and scientific research that led the world. They read American newspapers freely, comparing multiple viewpoints, something impossible in Nazi Germany. Hauptmann Dr. Wilhelm von Braun, a physicist conscripted from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, attended lectures on atomic physics at Camp Shelby. He later wrote, "American professors, including Jewish refugees from Germany, taught us without hatred. They spoke of science as universal, belonging to all humanity. They were years ahead of German research, and they shared knowledge with enemies." This generosity of spirit was incomprehensible to minds shaped by Nazi ideology. Hollywood films. The camp theaters showed American films, not propaganda, but regular Hollywood productions. Prisoners watched Gone with the Wind, seeing a depiction of American defeat and recovery that resonated with their own situation. They saw The Grapes of Wrath, amazed that Americans would show such self-criticism to enemies. "They hide nothing," wrote Lieutenant Josef Kramer. "They show their problems, their failures, their conflicts. Yet this honesty makes them stronger, not weaker. In Germany, such criticism would mean death. Here, it's considered patriotic." Spring 1944. Expanded labor. Spring 1944 brought expanded prisoner labor programs as American production hit its peak. German POWs worked in canneries, mills, and fabrication plants, witnessing the full might of American industrial capacity. The numbers told a story no propaganda could counter. At the Higgins Boat Factory in New Orleans, prisoners unloaded steel that would become landing craft for D-Day. They watched workers assemble 700 boats per month, each needing 20,000 parts. The factory employed 20,000 workers, including thousands of women who operated cranes, welded hulls, and managed production lines. Stabsfeldwebel Kurt Zimmermann wrote, "Women doing men's work, Negroes operating complex machinery, teenagers running drilling equipment. Everything we were told was impossible in a democracy. Yet production never stopped. 3 shifts, 24 hours, 7 days a week. They produced more boats in a month than our entire Navy built in a year." Republic Steel, Ohio. At Republic Steel in Ohio, prisoners witnessed the production of 10,000 tons of steel daily. The blast furnaces ran continuously, fed by endless trains of iron ore from Minnesota and coal from Pennsylvania. The scale defied German understanding. This single plant produced more steel than the entire Ruhr at its peak. "I worked at Krupp before the war," wrote Obergreiter Paul Hartmann. "I thought I understood industrial production. But this was beyond imagination. They wasted more steel in spillage than we could produce. The workers complained about overtime while producing quantities we couldn't achieve with slave labor and double shifts." Summer 1944. The summer 1944 harvest provided the final demolition of Nazi propaganda about American weakness. German prisoners worked across the Midwest. watching agricultural production that could feed the world. In Kansas, they saw wheat harvests where single farms produced more grain than entire German provinces. Combines moved across fields like ships across an ocean of gold, each one harvesting 100 acres per day. The grain elevators they filled could hold more wheat than Germany imported in an entire year. Unteroffizier Franz Weber, a farmer from East Prussia, wrote, "One American farmer with machinery does the work of 100 German farmers. They showed me aerial photographs of the wheat fields, thousands of square miles of grain. They could lose half their harvest and still have more than all of Europe combined." California's Central Valley. In California's Central Valley, prisoners picked fruit in orchards that stretched beyond the horizon. They watched as perfectly good fruit was thrown out for minor blemishes, fruit that would have been treasured back home. Entire crops were sometimes plowed under to maintain prices, a concept that caused psychological breakdown among prisoners from hunger-ravaged Germany. They destroyed food to keep prices stable, wrote Gefreiter Otto Schulz. Mountains of oranges were bulldozed into pits because they had too many. We begged to be allowed to send them to Germany, to our families. The guards were sympathetic, but explained it was impossible. The waste was strategic proof of unlimited resources. June 6, 1944. D-Day A. When news of the Normandy invasion reached the camps, German prisoners experienced their final ideological collapse. The scale of the operation: 6,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, 150,000 men in the first wave, demonstrated American organizational capacity beyond Nazi Germany's wildest dreams. Prisoners at Camp Shelby watched newsreels of the invasion within days. They saw the endless streams of ships, the artificial harbors, the supply system delivering 15,000 tons daily across open beaches. They watched their homeland being crushed by the very nation they'd been told was too weak to fight. Oberst Friedrich von Tauben wrote, "We knew then that everything was lost, not just the war, but the entire Nazi project. We'd challenged the world's greatest industrial power with fairy tales and racial mythology. We sent horses against their trucks, rifles against their automatic weapons, courage against their unlimited resources. American humanity." Throughout their captivity, German prisoners experienced something that challenged Nazi ideology more than any material wealth: American humanity. Despite propaganda depicting Americans as weak and sentimental, POWs discovered a people secure enough in their strength to show mercy. When Gefreiter Hans Miller's son died in the Hamburg bombing, the American camp commander personally delivered the Red Cross message and offered condolences. When Lieutenant Paul Fisher's wife wrote that she was struggling to feed their children, American church groups sent food packages to her in Germany, enemy civilians in a nation America was actively bombing. They separated the German people from the Nazi regime, wrote Hauptmann Otto. They said they were fighting Hitler, not Germans. This distinction, which seemed like propaganda, proved genuine. They prepared us to rebuild Germany after the war, not to destroy it. Medical care. The medical treatment particularly affected prisoners. German doctors worked alongside American medical staff, learning new techniques, using advanced equipment. Prisoners received operations that would have been available only to the elite back home. Mental health treatment, virtually unknown in the Wehrmacht, was provided to traumatized soldiers. Dr. Friedrich Bauer wrote, "They treated attempted suicides with counseling, not punishment. Prisoners with mental breakdowns received therapy, not beatings. This humanity toward enemies revealed a strength we never understood, the confidence of true power." March 1945. Re-education success. By March 1945, the secret re-education program had produced remarkable results. Over 25,000 prisoners had volunteered for democracy courses. The camp newspapers published articles about constitutional government, free markets, and civil rights. Discussion groups debated Germany's future after the war. The program's success exceeded all expectations. Prisoners who'd arrived as fanatical Nazis were writing essays about democratic reconstruction. Officers who'd sworn oaths to Hitler were planning how to implement American agricultural methods in post-war Germany. "We became missionaries for democracy," admitted Oberst Hermann Göring, no relation to the Reich Marshal, in a 1975 interview, "not through coercion or propaganda, but through observation. We saw it work. We saw ordinary people living better than the German aristocracy. We wanted that for Germany." The transformation was so complete that American authorities worried about prisoners being too enthusiastic about American ways. Some requested to stay in America after the war. Others married American women they met through prison correspondence programs. Thousands would eventually immigrate to America in the 1950s. April 1945. The final revelation. April 1945 brought the final revelation. As American forces liberated concentration camps in Germany, the footage was shown to German POWs. Many refused to believe it initially, claiming it was propaganda. But the evidence was overwhelming. Testimony from American soldiers, photographs, newsreels, eventually letters from Germany confirmed the horror. The psychological impact was devastating. Men who'd maintained some pride in German honor despite military defeat now faced the complete moral collapse of their nation. Everything they'd fought for wasn't just defeated, it was evil. Hauptmann Walter Schmidt wrote the most eloquent summary. "We thought we were warriors for a great cause. We discovered we were tools of criminals. We believed we were bringing civilization to inferior peoples. We found that we were the barbarians. The Americans we called weak and decadent showed us what civilization actually meant." May 1945. War's end. As the war ended in May 1945, German POWs faced repatriation with mixed emotions. They'd witnessed an America that contradicted everything they'd believed. They'd eaten better as prisoners than as soldiers. They'd been treated with more dignity by enemies than by their own government. The last months of captivity were spent preparing for a return to a destroyed Germany. American authorities provided vocational training, agricultural education, and political instruction. Prisoners learned about the Marshall Plan before it was announced, understanding that America would rebuild rather than punish Germany. "They prepared us to rebuild our country," wrote Oberst Friedrich von Tauben. "They gave us skills, knowledge, and hope. They transformed defeated soldiers into future citizens. This generosity from victors was incomprehensible to minds shaped by Nazi vindictiveness." Repatriation 1945 to 1946. Between 1945 and 1946, 371,683 German POWs were sent home from American camps. They returned to a Germany divided, destroyed, and destitute. But they brought something precious with them, knowledge of how a democratic industrial society worked. The German POWs who'd experienced American prosperity became unwitting agents of transformation in post-war Germany. They'd seen industrial efficiency, agricultural productivity, and democratic prosperity. They knew Reconstruction was possible because they'd witnessed a society that had achieved it. Their legacy. Many former POWs rose to prominence in West Germany's Reconstruction. Hans Kroll, prisoner at Camp Shelby, became West German ambassador to the United States. Walter Holstein, who taught classes at Camp Como, became president of the European Commission. Rüdiger von Wechmar, held at Camp Herne, served as German permanent representative to the United Nations. Eduard Ackermann, prisoner at Fort Robinson, became a leader in German agricultural reform. They brought American methods to German industry, American efficiency to German agriculture, and American democratic ideals to German politics. The economic miracle of the 1950s was built partly on knowledge gained in American prison camps. "We learned that prosperity came from freedom, not conquest," Hans Kroll wrote in his memoirs. "We saw that democracy created wealth, that diversity brought strength, that treating workers well increased production. These lessons learned as prisoners shaped the new Germany." Historical assessment. Historians have called the German POW experience in America one of the most successful re-education programs in history. Without coercion, without propaganda in the traditional sense, American industrial might and democracy converted hardened Nazis into future democratic citizens. The program succeeded because it relied not on words, but on observation. Prisoners saw American society functioning at peak efficiency while treating enemies with dignity. They witnessed industrial capacity that made German production look primitive. They experienced a standard of living that exposed Nazi promises as fantasies. Dr. Arnold Kramer, the leading historian of German POWs in America, concluded, "America won the propaganda war not through clever messages, but through sheer reality. Every full meal, every electric light, every working toilet was an argument against Nazism." The POWs were converted by prosperity. The numbers tell the story. The statistics support this assessment. Of 371,683 German POWs held in America, fewer than 1% attempted escape, only 2,222 total attempts. Post-war surveys showed 95% rated their treatment as good or excellent. Most remarkably, thousands maintained correspondence with American families for decades after the war. The 1985 reunion. In 1985, on the 40th anniversary of the war's end, surviving German POWs held a reunion in Austin, Texas. Over 500 former prisoners returned to America, many bringing their families to show them where their transformation had begun. Former Obergreiter Hans Weber, who'd been held at Fort Robinson, Nebraska, and later returned to become a physician in Georgetown, Maine, spoke at the reunion. Life in the camps was a vast improvement for many of us who'd grown up in cold water flats in Germany. We discovered running water, central heating, and abundant food. But more than that, we discovered dignity. Former Stabsfeldwebel Kurt Meyer, who'd worked on farms in Iowa, added, "The farmers treated us not as enemies, but as young men far from home. They shared their meals, their knowledge, sometimes their homes. This humanity from people whose sons were fighting against us, this changed us forever." The keynote address. At the 1985 reunion dinner, former Oberst Hermann Gotz, then 78 years old, delivered the keynote address that captured the essence of the transformation. "We came to America as enemies, as Nazis, as believers in a lie. We left as friends, as Democrats, as men who'd seen the truth. America showed us that strength doesn't come from conquest, but from production. Not from hatred, but from diversity. Not from tyranny, but from freedom." We witnessed the arsenal of democracy at full production. We saw farmers who produced food for the world, workers who built the tools of victory, and citizens who treated enemies with dignity. We learned that America's true weapon wasn't its bombs or tanks, but its inexhaustible capacity for creation and its unshakable confidence. We returned to Germany with a mission: to build a society that could create rather than destroy, that could prosper through peace rather than war. The Germany that rose from the ashes was built on lessons learned in American prison camps. We who came as conquerors left as students. To America, from your former enemies, now your friends, thank you for showing us the way. The auditorium erupted in a standing ovation. Americans and Germans together, former enemies united in recognition of a transformation that had seemed impossible when those first trains rolled into Texas in June 1943. By the numbers, the magnitude of the German POW experience in America can be measured in stark statistics that reveal both the scale of the operation and its remarkable success. Camp infrastructure. Over 500 camps across 45 states, every state except Nevada, North Dakota, and Vermont. 175 main camps with 325 branch camps. Camps built to house from 250 to 12,000 prisoners each. Construction completed in an average of 90 days per camp. Prisoner population: 371,683 German POWs, part of 425,871 total Axis POWs. Peak population in May 1945, average of 20,000 new arrivals monthly in 1943. 30,000 monthly after D-Day, 60,000 monthly in the final months of the war. Labor contribution: 14 million man-days of agricultural labor, 100 million board feet of lumber processed, $230 million in labor value, 1940s dollars, 80 cents daily wage per prisoner. Prisoners filled critical labor shortages in 46 states. Escape statistics: only 2,222 escape attempts from over 371,000 prisoners, 0.6%. 0 successful permanent escapes. Most escapees are recaptured within 24 hours. No American civilians harmed by escaped POWs. Educational programs: 40,000 plus enrolled in educational courses. 135 camp newspapers published, 30,000 taking English classes, 15,000 in vocational training. University correspondence courses for 8,000. Post-war immigration: approximately 5,000 former POWs immigrated to the US after the war. 12,000 plus maintained correspondence with American families. Average correspondence duration: 31 years. Many returned as tourists or business partners. Treatment assessment: 95% rated treatment as good or excellent. 74% believed captivity positively changed their worldview. 61% expressed interest in learning about democracy. Less than 10% maintained strong Nazi beliefs by 1945. The true victory: the German POWs who experienced American industrial might didn't just witness history. They were transformed by it. Their captivity became education, their defeat became enlightenment, and their imprisonment became liberation from the ideological chains of Nazism. In the end, America's greatest victory wasn't on the battlefield, but in the prison camps, where overwhelming evidence of democratic prosperity accomplished what armies couldn't: the complete transformation of enemy minds. The POWs had arrived believing in German superiority and American weakness. They left knowing the truth. American industrial might wasn't just overwhelming, it was incomprehensible to minds shaped by scarcity and tyranny. The journey home. The trains that had brought them into captivity in 1943 had carried warriors of the Third Reich. The ships that returned them to Germany in 1946 carried architects of democracy. They'd seen the future, and it worked. Their story stands as a testament to a profound truth. The most powerful weapon in America's arsenal wasn't military might, but the simple, overwhelming evidence of a free society's capacity to create abundance. The German POWs were stunned by American industrial might, but ultimately they were converted by it. In their transformation lay the seeds of Europe's post-war redemption and the final defeat of the Nazi dream. Building a new Germany. They returned to Germany not as defeated enemies, but as witnesses to what free societies could achieve. The economic miracle that transformed West Germany in the 1950s was built on foundations laid in American prison camps, where enemy soldiers learned that prosperity came not from conquest, but from freedom. Not from racial superiority, but from human dignity. Not from totalitarian control, but from democratic cooperation. What they expected versus what they found. The German POWs had arrived in America expecting to find a weak, divided nation on the verge of collapse. Instead, they discovered an industrial colossus of unlimited power and surprising humanity. They came as prisoners of war. They left as witnesses to the arsenal of democracy at its absolute peak. In their awe at American abundance lay the psychological seeds of the Atlantic Alliance, the Marshall Plan, and the democratic reconstruction of Germany. They'd seen America, and they would never be the same. The next generation, their children would grow up in a democratic Germany allied with the United States, a partnership built on the transformation that began when 1,850 Africa Corps veterans stepped off a train in Mexia, Texas, and discovered that everything they believed was wrong. A story of redemption. The story of German POWs in America is ultimately a story of redemption through revelation. It proves that sometimes the greatest victories are won not through destruction, but through demonstration. Not through propaganda, but through prosperity. Not through hatred, but through humanity. The German soldiers who witnessed American industrial might became the unwitting ambassadors of democracy, carrying back to their homeland the seeds of transformation that would bloom into one of history's most successful reconstructions. Their journey from Nazi warriors to democratic citizens remains one of the most remarkable transformations in modern history, accomplished not through force, but through the overwhelming evidence of what free people could achieve when they worked together. The secret weapon. In the end, that was America's secret weapon. Not just the ability to produce more tanks and planes than any nation in history, but the capacity to transform enemies into friends through the simple power of example. The German POWs were stunned by America's industrial might, but more importantly, they were changed by it, and in the change lay the foundation for a better world. They witnessed abundance that defied imagination. They experienced kindness that shattered ideology. They saw democracy in action and understood, perhaps for the first time, what true strength looked like. When they boarded those ships home in 1946, they carried with them something more valuable than any material possession: a vision of what their nation could become, not through conquest or domination, but through freedom, cooperation, and human dignity. That vision, planted in American prison camps and nurtured by American generosity, would help rebuild a shattered continent and forge a peace that has lasted generations. The trains may have brought them to Texas as enemies, but America sent them home as something far more powerful: believers in a better way,